Well, it is a real privilege to be here. And do you have a question? It wasn't your class. No, it wasn't. Neither of your classes were involved.
I have to say this again. I was just wondering if the notes you were burning out in the parking lot were Paul Anderson's course or mine.
No, neither. No, nobody here is implicated in the note burning. Yeah. Now, is there something I need to do to get this to project up there? Oh, you got it. Cool. Thank you. All right. So what I want to do today is I want to explore two ways I think Quakers have through history related to politics. The typology that I'm going to introduce to you is usually focused on Quaker peacemaking, but I think it applies to politics, and I want to do that. Look at that, and hopefully, if we have time, I want to explore some of John Woolman's writings and how he approaches political topics. But most importantly, this is something I'm interested in thinking about, and so I want to think about it with you. So I want you to be involved in this, and we're learning together here. That's my plan. Okay, so I want to be focused on approaches to politics as I see them in the Quaker tradition. And when we are done, I hope that these approaches will give you a handle for your own approaches to politics, how you approach thinking about political issues, and perhaps give you some language for that, and then maybe have some context for situating your own approach. Okay, so the typology that I want to share with you is based on Wolf Mendel's 1973 Swarthmore lecture. Wolf Mendel was a Quaker scholar and historian, and he argued that Quakers had changing views on peace over time. And he said that there was a movement in early Quakers from identifying their approach to peace as what he called the prophets, as sectarians and idealists, to the modern Quaker understanding as what he calls reconcilers, or realists, or denominationalists. Is anybody familiar with Wolf Mendel's work here already? Okay, so the prophetic approach is fixed on, if I were to kind of encapsulate it, it's what motivates the prophetic approach is this fixation on a holy horizon. It's eschatological. And can be even described as apocalyptic. It's like looking for this complete social transformation. The Reconcilers' position is concerned with practical means to an end. It's more tactical. And Mendel was speaking, again, specifically about the Quaker peace testimony, but I think we can, as we go along, I want you to have in your mind more generally about Quaker approaches to, or just approaches to politics. So if you can make that translation in your mind as we go through, like, how does this not only speak specifically to Quaker approaches to peace, but also how does this speak to my approach to politics? Okay, so Mendel argued that early Quakers can be described as spiritual visionaries, prophets, filled with this ideal. And I'm going to show you a quote here in a second. And then contemporary Quakers described as realists, reconcilers. Their attention is focused on the concrete particulars. So they're looking at like incremental changes. and looking for like maybe evidences of movement within, in society at large. So, and so pacifism for contemporary Quakers, or as embodied in this Reconcilers position, is often seen as the best tactic for creating a just world. It's like this is pacifism is the way in which we help bring about a just world, which is a little different than the early Quaker position, which was more holistic, more eschatological, like we're bringing the presence of Christ down to earth, and is more transformational. So Wolf Mendel argues that there's been some adaptation in the social and theological basis for the Quaker peace testimony over time. And I want to maybe draw some additional nuance to Mendel's approach and say that I think that all people have the prophet and the reconciler in them, and that these aren't like two clearly distinguishable aspects of our approaches. But I think, especially within the Quaker tradition, that these can be like a yin and a yang. Like they kind of pull upon each other, lean, and some rise up in some moments, and other aspects rise up in other moments. But there are times when one approach becomes dominant over the other in general. But I still think there's quite a bit of interplay between these approaches all the time. And then our own personal temperaments impact that as well. So I want to hold that these are approaches that Quakers have adapted and adopted over time. So thinking specifically about the early Quakers, and I'm defining that as roughly 1650 to 1660 or 1662. So early Quakers, they didn't deny that there was reality or evil in the world. They didn't try to avoid conflict. They believed that the military was important in the world that they lived in, but that they, as Quakers, were so transformed and redeemed and delivered out of that state of sinfulness that they no longer could, like they couldn't any longer participate in violence, in war. So they were in this completely different state that made that impossible for them to participate in. And that's, partially is this, they had they believed that Christ had returned inwardly and spiritually within them. And it was a real spiritual second coming that changed the course of history. And it changed their lives. Through them, the second coming of Christ within them was changing the world around them, and that their experience was the first fruits of the reign of Christ in the world. So they were kind of on the leading edge of God's new work in the world. And so early in the Quaker movement, Fox says that he lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion of all wars. So, like, I'm in a new place. Wars don't make any sense to me anymore. Like, some people might say wars are anachronistic, meaning they're out of time. They're out of the time in which Fox lived, or in his experience. So he's suggesting that in his spiritual conversion, he's now in a spirit beyond the strife and greed of sin and outward war. He was in a new state in the power of Christ, embodied in the Sermon on the Mount, that was this first fruits of Christ's reign over society. So he rejected fighting, physical weapons, because he had already experienced that spiritual victory. And early Quakers argued that physical swords are, I have in my notes, physical swords are pointless, which is kind of a pun there. Physical swords are pointless when the physical sword can only affect the carnal nature. But what's of true significance is the spiritual nature. So Christ would eventually, as the beginning of that inward second coming in the early Quakers, that would continue rolling through society, and soon Christ would govern all of society in that same way. And the early Friends thought this was inevitable. So in 1660, there was a rebellion in England, and a group called the Fifth Monarchy Men they staged an unsuccessful overthrow of the government and wanted to kill the king, and as a backlash to that, all kind of religious dissenters were being persecuted. And so the Quakers in 1660, they wrote a letter to distinguish themselves from the methods of the monarchy men, to say that we don't act that way, and I'll tell you why. And so here's a quote I pulled from there. "We do earnestly desire and wait that by the word of God's power and this effectual operation in the hearts of men, the kingdoms of this world may become the kingdoms of the Lord and of his Christ, that he may rule and reign in men by his Spirit and truth, that thereby all people out of every profession may be brought into love and unity with God and one with another, and that they may all come to witness the prophet's words who said, 'Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.'" So the Quakers were kind of situating their position as one of being focused on this eschatological reign that Christ brings out. So it doesn't make sense for us to take up weapons and and act violently against the government because we have already have this inward experience, and we believe God is remaking the world in accordance with the kingdom of God, and in which nation shall not lift up swords against nation. And so this vision is so compelling that that the Quakers weren't really concerned with how do you actually do that? They weren't focused on practical steps. It was an embrace of the vision that they sought out. So this is very different. This is a very different position than the Christian realism that was present during this time and still present today, that we might associate with Martin Luther and with Augustine. For Martin Luther and Augustine, theologians of other traditions, the world was assumed to be evil, naturally evil, and sinfulness and imperfection of the world means that sometimes, for Luther and Augustine, Christians needed to choose the lesser of two evils. And sometimes choosing the lesser of two evils meant taking up physical weapons and acting violently to destroy or to contain or to restrain the evil that was threatening to kind of overpower. The early Quakers did not really have a sense of sometimes we have to do the lesser of two evils. Because their vision, they had such faith in the vision that the vision was going to be successful, that they could hold firm to that. So here's a little diagram of how we might think about their position. So can you see that? Yeah. Okay, so in case you can't see too clearly on the screen, the God's perfect world is a slightly different color than the unconverted world, and it's going over the unconverted world. So Quakers viewed themselves as these this vanguard people, these harbingers whose actions within the world, within time, through their testimony, was establishing God's will on earth. So it's like that God's perfect world was actually flowing over the world, the unconverted world characterized by sin, death, and war. So it's kind of like an insurgent presence. And that's what they saw as their vision was embodying. So Fox says, I saw that there was an ocean of darkness and death, but an infinite ocean of light and love, which flowed over the ocean of darkness. So now if we transition to contemporary Quakers as reconcilers, Mendel argues that contemporary Quakers, and again, he's writing this in 1973, but he's really thinking about the 20th century at that point, that he argues that contemporary Quaker views of the peace testimony are secular in that they are no longer focused on a spiritual conversion of the world as the basis for their pacifism. And instead, pacifism is sometimes viewed as detached from the spiritual roots. Like pacifism is good in and of itself, regardless of what spiritual tradition or none. Or at least the spiritual roots have changed. So Quakers today don't necessarily view themselves as being the vanguard of God's reign over society, kind of knocking down spiritual walls as the early Quakers did, but rather pacifism is more likely to derive from like a more general sense of love for humanity, human dignity, similar to how other religions and other religious groups approach pacifism. And again, peacemaking is an effective tactic to achieve the end of a loving and healthy society. So this is how Wolf Mendel is kind of breaking out these approaches. So we could say that the Friends' peace testimony has become secular because pacifism is not inextricably linked to any sort of religious conversion to a new universal ideal. It's instead seen as the best course of action, whether a person is Quaker or not. And again, I want to be clear that I'm not lifting up one as the ideal over the other. I think these are ways to examine our approaches to politics, and just to analyze how we've come to religiously based ideas about politics. So for most British and American Quakers of the 20th century, the cause of war is seen as deriving from particular socio-political events like the arms race, or competition over non-renewable sources of energy, or inequitable distribution of food and other resources. Contemporary Quakers tend to believe that if these practical and political issues were resolved, then the necessity for war would diminish or go away. And so that's different than the early Quaker view, which would have been spiritualized. That the reason for war was that there is still yet some unconverted, but we're pushing God's reign on earth, and it's advancing. Okay, let's see. Oh, and another thing that I want to mention too is for the reconciler position, that Quakers in the 20th century have built institutions to help carry out their visions, and that institutionalization of testimonies was not present. Not even there was no ability to do that in the early Quakers, whereas for the early Quakers, each person themselves had to embody that. And now there's more of a kind of professionalization and an institutionalization of the acting out of these testimonies. Okay, so before I go on to talk about Woolman, I just want to put this back up and just ask or allow you the opportunity to have some feedback on this typology, and whether there are helpful handles within Wolf-Mendel's typology that are useful for thinking about like what we assume to be the way to engage in political reflection. Paul?
Mendel, is he operating on a basis of London Yearly Meeting or Britain Yearly Meeting?
Yeah.
So he's not really looking at the revivalist tradition, which would see the changing of the world as happening one person at a time, that repentance and giving your life to Christ, that's the way to change the world, which within this analysis would be closer to early friends. Of course, evangelical friends haven't gotten as well organized, to stand up against violence as some of our more liberal friends have done. But just any comments on who speaks for Quakers or even Mendel's awareness of ways that different Quakers might be working?
Yeah, I don't think that he has much of an awareness to that. This is the Swarthmore Lecture, which is an annual lecture given at London Yearly, at that time now Britain Yearly Meeting, and so he's speaking to an audience that's British unprogrammed liberal friends, and I think so. He's a historian, but there's also kind of a sociological analysis being done here. But yeah, that's a good qualification. Anybody else have any comments or insights or anything helpful, Irv?
I just find this a helpful paradigm, not just about Quakers, but about conservative Christianity. In my young adulthood, exposed to evangelical Christianity, the solution was simple: get people converted. And then you bring that into present day times, that mentality, I think, is still alive. So if we have a Christian leader, that will be the solution. And what that boils down to is if that leader uses Christian phraseology without Christian values. But their critique then was that the sociological thing is just worldly. That's liberalism, and it doesn't work because the world is essentially sinful. So it would always revert back to the conversion of individuals. So I just find this to be a really helpful paradigm to address that.
Well, there's two in the back.
I think things are happening now. Pope 14, I think his influence on us is profound. Interesting, most interesting, and how that bends in with what you're talking about too. He seems like an extremely bright man.
Yeah.
So that's all. Let's look forward to his comments.
And Carol.
Yeah, Quakers have always been considered part of the Peace Church tradition with the Mennonites and Church of the Brethren, which Daniel Smith Christopher always reminds us. Do you see this same movement from prophets to reconcilers in these other traditions as well?
That's a really good question. So I would say yes, especially, I'm just thinking about that question for the first time. And it's speaking specifically of Mennonites, I think so. We see the kind of the radical eschatological ideal of Menno Simons and the early community then being adapted, and adaptation for Quakers and for Mennonites was like part of their survival, being adapted, and you know, as Mennonites have become more, you know, what Wolf Mendel would say denominational, meaning working with the world rather than opposing the world, and developing institutions like Mennonite Central Committee, that I think they would be following the same pathway. I think this is, you know, natural for religious groups over time to follow this pathway. And then we don't have time to go into it today, but I do sometimes then think about examples of like contemporary examples of Quakers who then seem to like pop up and do things that embody the idealist, the visionary as well in contemporary society. So I think there is a movement over time, and yet there's still those themes within the DNA that pop up and allow to kind of, you know, radical expressions from time to time.
Yeah, and I was thinking also, as Paul brought up, within the kind of early revival movement, evangelical movement, Pentecostal movement, the early Pentecostals were pacifists. But as they changed, they didn't become reconcilers so much as just war theorists. I mean, they would say war then is just. And Seventh-day Adventists would be another example. Most of them are not pacifists anymore, but they would join the military, as some Quakers also have done. But there seems to be different ways that this eschatological vision of peace moves into a secular world.
We'll do Richard Evans, and then we'll do Dwight.
Thank you, Mark. So I like attending meetings like this where we can discuss these really important issues. I just want to take you back in history a little bit here to the meeting. Reedwood formerly was a meeting that was called First Friends, and in a different location. And my connection with pacifism it goes way back to the 50s. And I just returned from serving on an aircraft carrier in the Korean War and was introduced to Quakerism. And our meeting, the First Friends meeting, I think practically everyone in that meeting was a conscious objector. I mean, they won me over real quick. And, you know, that's interesting how we have evolved to Reedwood and what, you know, examine ourselves today. What are we like today? Where are we headed? What are we doing? And, you know, some of the important things to notice is that, you know, I was just noticing this morning, we have 11 aircraft carriers out online right now. Why? Why wouldn't we do something about that or say something about it? And they cost $6.5 million a day to operate. And so, you know, what are we doing as a Quaker meeting to oppose some of this? You know, and back years ago in the George W. Bush era, our Congress passed a law that allowed a president to start a war. Prior to that, it took Congress. And Quakers have been lobbying for the dissolving of that particular legislation for years. I've been part of it. And so, I'm an activist here and now, and we need to have our meeting, approach these issues and face them.
Well, I'm swirling here mentally about my own war, which is the Vietnam War, and how I got sucked into that. And the term pacifism, which became a kind of a negative word to me because it was connected to passive. And so I don't use the word pacifism, I use the word peacemaker, which is more symbolic of what I think I'm about. I was wondering if the 1660s, did they have the draft? And because if you had mandatory service, it put more on the line than just writing a letter back saying, I don't participate in war. And those of us in the Vietnam era had to make a choice and spend 2 or 3 years serving alternate service. And I can't tell you the number of hours I spent discussing this with the supervisor, who was a Green Beret veteran. That was my boss. He was trying to understand my spiritual connection, and I was trying to understand his military one, and we had a lot of trouble. And but a lot of that was overcome just by respect for one another. But we were attending a church in which it was a holy war. It was God's will that we defeat the spread of communism. And if you were a patriot, you would serve. And then as the information came in, that it was based on a lot of it on lies and false stories and whatever. But yeah, I was just wondering, I guess, was there a draft in 1660, and would they be confronted with the same decisions I had to make? And of course, part of the argument was, what would you do with Hitler? If he's killing your mom, that kind of thing. Or the Bosnia War that Clinton had to confront, where they lined up 1,000 boys and men and shot them. Why didn't we do something about that more quickly? Anyway, that's what I'm swirling with as I'm trying to think about the ideal and the contemporary. I'm going, and you're right, it overlaps.
Yeah, people were conscripted into the military in the 1650s and 1660s, and they tried to conscript Fox, and he refused, and so it was, for I think an extra year, and Carol may be able to help me here with this. I mean, then about the time the 1660s, it became illegal for Quakers to have government employ, and so then I don't think they were asked to conscript at the point at which they were not allowed to participate in government. Isn't that right, Carol?
Yeah, I think that is right. But it's also important to remember that many early Quakers have served in the army. Quakers in the road
Prior.
in the Civil War. So I should have to find that. So Quakerism rose during the English Civil War, so many of the early Quaker men had served in the army and were believing that the army was going to bring in, the military force would bring in the second coming, and then they were very disillusioned when that didn't happen. So part of the peace testimony probably came out of their disillusionment and maybe their PSTD from actually serving during the war. Yeah.
Yeah, so many of the Valiant 60 kind of group of leaders had prior experience already. Okay, so this is the typology, and it's a way to think about our approaches to peace and to politics, and like what kind of a lens are we using when we approach them, when we think about the issues that are in front of us today. So I want to now look at talk very briefly about Woolman. So John Woolman was born in 1720 in New Jersey. He died in 1772 in York, England. He is famous for his anti-slavery positions. At times in his life, he walked on ministry journeys up and down the East Coast, going from meeting to meeting and even home to home in some cases, working with folks, preaching his interpretation of the gospel, which was often one that challenged them to re-examine their lives, their possessions, and how they interacted with the world, especially in regard to human enslavement. And he authored a journal and several essays. And here's a marker near where he is believed to have been buried in York, England. And so it says, you can see it says near this stone, because they didn't use headstones when he was actually buried. But somewhere near there. Okay, in 1768, he submitted to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting that oversees publications his essay Pure Wisdom. And so this is what I want to think about with you. So at the beginning, he has an introduction where he kind of lays out his spiritual vision. And let's think about whether it's prophet or reconciler. When does this go till 12? 12, okay. And then he has chapters. And he has a chapter on what I'm calling social conventions, and then on labor, on education, on wealth. And then he had a chapter that he submitted on trade. So these are interesting, topics that are in the news today in our political discussions. And the essay on trade was not approved for publication. It was deferred in committee speak and wasn't officially published until 1922 for the first time, a couple hundred years after he was already deceased. But he kept it with his paperwork so that people could find it. And so he wrote a little note saying why it wasn't published and kept it in his papers. So this essay is not very commonly read, not very well known. You can't get it in the most popular versions of Woolman's writings, but it's really interesting and powerful. So this is 1768, so just 4 years before he dies. And at this point in his life, I think he's becoming a little bit more radical and more focused on this experience of God remaking the world in real time. So he starts off by quoting from James 3:17, because he uses the term pure wisdom throughout his writings. And what does pure wisdom mean? Well, he quotes from James 3:17 to give us a definition of pure wisdom. And it's that wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. So he defines pure wisdom, which shows up in his writings dozens and dozens of times, that phrase, pure wisdom. And whenever he uses it, he's meaning this. He's meaning a type of understanding that's not tainted by prejudice, that's not tainted by what he calls partiality, that bears good fruits, that's full of mercy. And this state of pure wisdom is how he wants Quakers and all people to engage in their social environment. Okay, and so so that's what pure wisdom means. Then at the end of the introduction, this is a long quote, and there's a lot of good stuff in here. At the end of his introduction, he lays out his vision that then defines how he thinks about the specific issues he's going to move into. So, but where people walk in that pure light in which all their works are wrought in God, and so he's sprinkling in biblical quotations, and under oppression, persevere in the meek spirit, and abide firm in the cause of truth, without actively complying with oppressive demands, through those the Lord hath often manifested his power in opening the understandings of others. So he's speaking to, I think, Fred, is that, who spoke earlier, the point of that through the example and testimony of folks who are not complying in sinful structures, that can open up the understanding of others. And let's see, to the promoting of righteousness in the earth. A time, I believe, is coming wherein this divine work will so spread and prevail that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor learn war anymore. So this time where the light and truth, the pure wisdom of Christians spreading through their testimony, the actions of God, he says, is I believe is coming, where it will so spread and prevail that nations will no longer lift up sword against each other. So he's like pointing to this time that's already that is promised in the Bible. And then he goes a step further. And as we, through the tender mercies of God, do feel that this precious work is begun, so it's not just in the future, it's begun, I am concerned to encourage my brethren and sisters in holy care and diligence, that each of us may so live under the sanctifying power of truth as to be redeemed from all unnecessary cares. And then he lays out this image that he uses in several of his writings to describe what the spiritual life looks like, that as it goes and as it makes decisions and goes through a really difficult society, difficult times, like we experience today, is that our eye being single to him, no customs, however prevalent, which are contrary to the wisdom from above, may hinder us from faithfully following in his leadings, in whatsoever he may graciously appoint for us. So he's like, the life of the Christian, the life of the faithful person, is that their eye is so singly focused on God that distractions fall to the wayside, and it's a way to. I mean, he's advocating this as a way to make decisions in a complicated world. And just to contextualize this a little bit, like 1768, we may think of it as like, oh, those were the good old days. No, like the 7 Year War had just happened, which was traumatic, and already the seeds of revolution are starting. The colonial society is changing. It's going from primarily an agrarian society to more and more wealth held within fewer and fewer hands. The human enslavement is becoming more and more common, even in the mid-Atlantic colonies where Woolman lived. The relations with indigenous people are becoming more and more tense as new rounds of settlers are continuously pushing into the interior places that were understood to be it was understood that English colonists would not go there. So things are tense in 1768. And he's offering this vision of an eye so focused on God that Christians can navigate it faithfully, and not only navigate that world faithfully, but be such a witness that it's part of this spreading of the gospel of the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And so then after he lays out this vision, then he goes to look at specific issues. But I'm not so interested in those specific issues right now. I'm interested in what you think about his approach of laying out this larger vision, and then that's like his operating system. That's what's driving him to consider the specific issues in the way that he does. So I think here he is definitely channeling Wolf Mendel's prophetic typology, because it's just this powerful spiritual vision of transformation. But I'm interested in you and whether or not, when you approach political issues, or when you approach thinking about the issues of this day, do you start from a core understanding of what you think God is doing in the world and like the life of the faithful person? Or do you start by looking at an issue and then thinking about the issue and how you feel about the issue? I think I do that latter. I think I tend to think here's an issue, and then what do I think about that? And I'm wondering if it makes me a bit more reactive rather than reflective in my approach to considering political issues. And I think I want to now open it up to you all for discussion on what you have found to be meaningful, if Woolman's example is helpful, and if there's anything in that typology, of Wolf Mendel's typology, that helps us not be reactionary, but be reflective and intentional in our engagement with political issues. So that's a lot that I'm just now throwing into your laps. But what do you think when you think about an issue? Do you start from a core set of convictions, or do you think do you tend to approach it more piecemeal, issue by issue? And what do you see as the advantages or disadvantages of either approach?
Thanks, John. Really good work. At George Fox last year, we had a symposium on C.S. Lewis and just war theory, or against pacifism. And I raised a question about Jesus. Blessed are the peacemakers. Put away the sword. Walter Wink's transforming moment, or Jesus as a third way and transforming people. And the presenter spoke back and said, well, that might work if people have a conscience. But you're dealing with somebody like Putin or somebody like Islamic terrorism, that's not going to work. So that brings in the realism question. Or like some of the Quakers during the World Wars, what do you do when you've got somebody like Hitler out there, or real atrocities out there? So yeah, any thoughts of those kinds of realism issues? I suppose what I might say is, well, let's go and testify to Putin. Let's go and testify to the Ayatollah. Any volunteers ready to go to Iran? Like Mary Fisher did to the Sultan of Turkey? I mean, I don't know, any thoughts on that conviction of truth, which is central to the peace testimony, when you also have realism out there in some other ways?
Yeah, and I'm trying to contextualize that for like maybe how Woolman would have answered that potentially, and I can't. I think Woolman and the early Quakers would not have been able to say that somebody doesn't have a conscience, or that the conscience is so damaged as to not be able to be converted, and so that's in their, where they are, I think. But we have these examples. I mean, in Hitler, as Dwight mentioned earlier, he is another example of that. I think it makes it really challenging. But I think, like you said, I think this is where our calling is to live out that life of testimony. And Woolman would say that he felt like he could let go of being concerned about the outcomes of his ministry and just be fully attentive to the faithful action of his ministry. And when he tried to look at the outcomes, he got discouraged because some people did not release their slaves. But by focusing on the faithful embodiment of the testimony, then there are those who people could be converted, and eventually it changed the culture in a way that reduced that made it impossible for slaveholders to continue to be a part of the Society of Friends, and then slowly over time, slaveholding itself is made illegal, no longer part of the culture. So I think I want to hold on to the testimony and the faithful action, and not knowing when or if or how it may come to fruition, or how it may change things, in my lifetime even.
I think like a recurring issue with white, educated, pretty well-to-do men that write in this era is the fallacy that everyone's like me, or can be like me. You see that in like the writings of Emerson and Thoreau, and the American Enlightenment, and it's like, well, that's great that you can live by Walden Pond and do experiments with simplicity and gain enlightenment from nature. But what about for the African American slave? But what about for the person that, I would have a hard time pastorally. There's hope in, yes, the work has begun, but pastorally to say to some that are already feeling the pressure of oppression that is not their fault, to say, well, let your eye be single. It's kind of a dismissal of what's needed is action, not contemplation. Or is that a false dichotomy of saying, well, contemplation is not action? No, I think ideally it's one and the same. So I love Woolman. I love what he has to write. And I like what he has to say. I just would think for some people that have the privilege to be there, this is really good advice. For some people that don't have privilege, people on the margins or people that are squeezed by the way just how society works. This may not work as well. It just may not be a good approach. So, and Woolman is a wise person. He would understand that, you know. So I feel like this may be writings for people that are a lot like John Woolman, and not everyone.
We have another comment in the back. And while you're on the way back there, this is also where Dwight's point about how pacifism has the negative connotation of being passive, but in Woolman's case, he was quite active, and he did like real things to improve the lives of people who were enslaved, and encouraged even enslaved people even to listen to the Spirit and to listen to God, but not in a way of like giving up. So so there's that tension there as well.
Yeah, I was going to say it reminds me of Viktor Frankl, who survived concentration camps and the Holocaust, and said when all the other human freedoms are taken away, we remain with the freedom to choose. And in that case, his survival was based on something very parallel to what Woolman is arguing, that we have that choice to succumb to despair or to focus on where we still have agency. Though I agree, Mark, it would be very difficult as a pastor to advise that to someone if you're not also in that space. But just coming from inside of that space, I think Frankel's point is good.
Choice is a big one. Perhaps I met a version of John Woolman, 1967, in a friend's service committee office, University of Washington, just off the avenue there. Perhaps you're familiar with it. I was in a pinch, and just what was I to do? And so the counselor there said, what I would recommend, and this is kind of a quote, go into the belly of the beast and see if you can do some good. End of quote. A very, very dangerous assignment, as it turned out. but I followed that, and I don't regret it. One other further comment is that when I did go into the belly of the beast, I found out what a terrible soldier I made. I was ruined because I was following my own beliefs, and I did some good. So anyway, end of comment.
Any final words? Anything? Scott? Well, Lena? Okay. Well, go ahead, Scott.
I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. I'm struck. I'm trying to figure out a way to frame this, and one of the things that Sean said strikes me: the agency to choose. And I'm latching onto the word agency. I'm feeling now like, even if my theology was good and I made good choices, I don't have much agency. And I think a bigger problem, like, I'm not going to get drafted. I don't have to not kill somebody tomorrow. I do have to deal with people that are annoying, and I'm not going to punch them. But I don't see myself advancing us to that holy horizon. And further, when I look at churches, it seems to me like even the churches, the message has been somehow made to fit everybody so that we can all be comfortable, so we can go to heaven, so we can be spiritual. And you know, now it's getting more complicated. It doesn't matter if we kill people. We can do trade. We can use money. We can withhold money and kill millions. And that's, you know, that I have some agency there. I can vote, but I guess it's the agency thing. I don't, even if I was a model Quaker, I don't know that I will change the world at all. And I'm not, and I'm sure I'm not changing the world. So I liked your sermon today about whiskey priests. I'm gonna go get some whiskey this afternoon. But I think that's where I'm at, and I think I've talked long enough.
Okay, so that's really helpful. So thank you. So one thing I want to mention here is that the point of using this quote from Woolman is not to say that we need to think like Woolman, because I don't think we can go back in time and take on the mindset of an 18th century colonial Quaker. We live in a different time, in a different era. We're thinking about Woolman as an example of how he was, whether or not you agree with him, with his approach, or agree with his statements or not, he's very intentional. He's thinking about, how am I true to what God wants me to do and apply that to the political landscape in which I live? And so what I'm most wanting us to think about today is that same question. How do we be true to ourselves and to God to the best of our abilities within our political landscape? And it's probably, you know, maybe we don't have the confidence to say today that the grand eschatological work of beating plowshares, swords into plowshares is happening, and we don't have maybe the same understanding of our role to society that the early Quakers did, of an ocean of light overcoming and conquering within our lifetimes an unconverted world. But those examples raise questions for us about how we approach political decisions. Because we don't have the freedom to not think about it. We have to be reflective and think about it and apply our background, our faith, our lives, our experiences to our situation today. And so that's what I really want to think about and to leave you with as we try to the best of our abilities of, you know, what does it mean for us to keep our eyes single to God.
Thank you for your presentation today. I really appreciated it. And I like the John Woolman thing, you know, on slavery and so on. I want to just give one of my own personal experiences, fast forward. I was in a book group with the Hillsdale Library, and we read The Underground Railway by Colin Whitehead. And in our book discussion, and there was 25 or 30 people there, I asked the question, how would you view the slave catcher in that book to ICE agents in today's world? Okay? And there wasn't a single person in that entire group of over 25 people that said anything. Didn't make a single, and the facilitator there, she says, hey Dick, she says, we can't handle that question. That was the end of it. Just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
I think our official time is up. I'm happy to stay and discuss with anybody. But
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. And can you say that one more time? Your concluding thought. How is Woolman's? It's not a reproduction. We're trying not to reproduce Woolman's context. But the essence of Woolman is you said it so well there at the end, asking us how to.
yeah, I think Woolman would even understand that we can't go back in time and like adopt his mentality, like what we see in this quote, and bring it into the contemporary world. But what it does is it gives us an opportunity to interrogate our own approaches to faith and politics so that we can, like him, embody that intentionality and embody that that passion to live our lives single to God, even though it may look very different than what it looked like for Woolman. So that's what I think. That intentionality piece of examining our approaches to understanding politics and peace and how we exist in this really complicated and often ugly society, how we maintain that faithfulness.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's an excellent way to conclude our intersection of faith and politics. Thank you so much, John, for doing double duty and for the quality and quantity of your messages. Thank you so much. Let's give John a hand.
Thank you.
Go in peace, dear friends.